In the year 1913, a gentleman named Hudson Stuck, who was the Archdeacon of the Yukon, put together the first successful expedition to climb Mount McKinley, 20,320 feet. The four-man team spent 7 weeks on the mountain, and en route, they shot caribou and bighorn sheep for their food. They boned the animals out, and they put the meat in a big pot, and they boiled it down, poured the water off, and then poured butter into the pot. After that, they made baseball-sized butter balls of meat by the hundreds. They laid them out in the snow until they froze, and then they filled their knapsacks with the meat, and that's what they ate for the next 7 weeks. They would take a butter ball of meat at night and throw it in a pot with water, add rice and dried vegetables. Very intrepid explorers. This was long before the days of bottled oxygen and Gore-Tex and good mountaineering gear. They climbed the mountain wearing moccasins on their feet with 8 pairs of socks to keep their toes from freezing. They were the first successful team, and they carried a tall wooden pole all the way to the summit, planted it in the peak, and they could see it from Fairbanks to prove that they had climbed it. The first person on the team to reach the summit was a young man of 21 named Walter Harper. A number of years later, Walter Harper developed typhoid fever, and while he was in the hospital in Fairbanks recovering, he fell in love with the young nurse that was attending him. He asked her to marry him, and she consented, and for their honeymoon, they decided to go south, as many people did in that era. They took a paddle wheeler up the Yukon River from Fairbanks to Whitehorse, Yukon Territory, where they then boarded the train to Skagway. Once they arrived in Skagway, they had to wait for a steamer to arrive. Skagway was choked with snowbirds, if you will, at that point in history, and eventually a steamer came into port called the Princess Sophia. Typically, the Princess Sophia was outfitted to carry about 250 passengers, but because of the vast number of people wishing to travel south in October of 1918, they overloaded the ship with 354 people. The ship set sail from Skagway to Vancouver, and halfway between Skagway and Juneau, right in the middle of Lynn Canal, the Princess Sophia ran aground on a charted rock called Vanderbilt Reef. The skipper radioed for help, and other ships came to his aid, and once they were there and he felt secure, he went down into the hold of the ship and took a closer inspection. And he noticed the ship was not leaking or damaged, and so he declined the offer to offload the passengers in hopes of floating the ship off the reef that night with the incoming tide. But as fate would have it, a ferocious storm came roaring out of the Yukon that night with winds of over 100 miles an hour. The other ships had to flee for their own safety, and over the course of 3 days, the Princess Sophia broke apart on Vanderbilt Reef and sank with all hands. All 354 people perished. It was the worst maritime disaster in the Pacific Ocean up until that point in history. Just the kind of story you want to hear on a cruise, isn't it? There was one survivor. There was a little dog that was able to swim the 5 miles to the beach. But Walter and Frances Harper were on board the Princess Sophia that night that it went down, on their honeymoon. And we'd like to sing a tune for you about the wreck of the Princess Sophia.
I will love you forever, my darling, my lover, Mrs. Harper, my wife. And the north wind is starting to blow in. Hold tightly, my darling, hold tight. Fast on a reef in the
Thank you very much.